Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Common Mistakes when Defining Continuous Improvement Projects. My name is Alexandra Chofi, Director of Marketing for Operations Strategy Consulting. All too often, we see projects falter, lose momentum, and stall. When we meet with the project lead, the cause is quickly identified as something they had control over the entire time, but failed to do well. What is that key step? Project definition. It has been shown that 50% of a project's success is determined by how well the project has been defined. To help make your next project a success, this webinar will help you avoid the most common mistakes we see people make when they launch a project. Presenting today's webinar will be Megan Burns, Founder and Managing Director of Operations Strategy. She has more than 15 years of industrial engineering and supply chain management experience. She has spoken at industry conferences, and her articles have appeared in both regional and national publications. A certified Six Sigma Master Black Belt, Megan has worked with companies throughout North America and in 14 different countries. During her career, Megan Burns has coached and mentored hundreds of people through various projects. She will draw on that experience to share why some projects seem to complete themselves and why others never get off the ground. Before we get started, we would like you to know that at any time during this presentation, you can submit questions to us below.
Thank you, Alexandra. And I'm glad all of you are here joining us today because project definition is a big deal. Does it matter? Of course. Typically, we get into these challenges that say, well, why do I need to bother spelling out all these details? Isn't that just adding bureaucracy to the project and the process? Or the assumption, well, I know what the problem is. Let me just go solve it and go fix it. Sometimes I've encountered this. Well, we have a problem statement. Isn't that enough? Isn't that all we need to get started? Well, unfortunately, no, it's not. Do you know how important project definition matters? 50%. 50% of your project's success is based upon how well you define the project. And let me give you some insight into this. When I went through Six Sigma training as a black belt way back in 1997, there was no defined phase to Six Sigma. You just started straight out in the measure phase. And that's how Motorola had developed it and how it had been spread through Allied Signal and ABB and a lot of the other large organizations. But it was GE who realized that, you know what, if we don't do this define piece really well, then our projects are taking much longer than necessary. And we were having a pretty high abandonment rate because we weren't defining them well to begin with. So GE was actually the organization that created the define phase when we're talking about Six Sigma. And quite honestly, it doesn't matter whether it's Six Sigma or some other continuous improvement program. The bottom line is, if you define what you're going to do, the chances of you achieving it go up dramatically than if we just start right out trying to measure and baseline our existing current condition. The other impact that project definition has, in addition to your project success rate, as I alluded to on the previous slide, is project time. If you define your project well, by default, you're going to get to the answer or the root cause much more quickly, and so it shortens the duration of your project. The other impact it has, well, it increases the acceptance of whatever your continuous improvement initiative is. Because if you are just running projects and they tend to stall out, people are very confident in that. They lose confidence in it and become a bit jaded, which leads us to the human side. People by nature need that pat on the back. They need that attaboy. So if you want to be successful in your projects and your continuous improvement initiatives, we need to get the define piece down and do it well. Otherwise, we're not going to be as successful in the other factors that surround our continuous improvement initiative. So, what are the mistakes that we have seen most often, and how can you avoid them? Well, the very first mistake is poor problem statements. And honestly, this is probably the most common mistake. When we see poor problem statements, what we typically see are problem statements that perhaps give us the entire history of the problem, or they tell us what they think the root cause to the problem is, or what they think the solution is, or the problem is I don't have a database, or I don't have this new tool. Well, the problem with that is all you're doing is describing the symptoms. You're just explaining, well, this is what I see happening, instead of really telling us, well, how does the problem manifest itself? It's going to help you get to the root cause. Here's an example. How many times have you had someone come up to you and say, hey, we have a lot of scrap out there, go fix it. Or something along the lines of this. Hey, we have a problem with paint jobs. When are you going to fix it? Well, with something that broad and quite honestly general and vague, trying to use that as a problem statement is going to make it very difficult to get to the root cause, because we don't really know what the problem is. We're just looking at these symptoms. So instead of being a firefighter and just taking on a problem statement like that and jumping in and trying to fix it, I want you to take on a different perspective. I want you to imagine you're a doctor. Think about that. When you go to the doctor's office, they ask you lots of questions because they're trying to get down to what is the root cause. You can go in and tell them, yes, I have a runny nose and a headache and a fever. And they're not going to say, well, here's how you get rid of your runny nose, or here's how you bring down a fever. They're trying to get to, well, what is the virus that's causing that? And, what degree of urgency needs to be surrounded with it. It's the same thing when we're in our businesses. We need to look at our problem statement as a doctor would be. And instead of getting all caught up in the emotion and the hubbub of all of these symptoms, we need to look at, well, what is the actual problem? And when you do that, you need to be clear and concise, especially with your problem statements. They need to be based on facts. I can't tell you how many times I've heard problem statements that sound like, well, the problem is our vendors are terrible, or our people don't know what they're doing. You know what? Sometimes it feels like that, and maybe there is a grain of truth in there, but it's not based on data. And finally, a good problem statement is going to be within your scope of control, something you can actually take action on so you can improve the process. So, mistake number 1, spend the time to actually define a good working problem statement, something that focuses on what happens when the problem is present, and define where are you currently and where do you need to be. Now, the second mistake that I see is even when people have a good, well-written problem statement, the scope is too large. And if we have a project scope that's too large, well, obviously you risk burnout with your team because you're dragging out the project's timeline. And when that happens, you actually are indirectly increasing the resistance to your project or your continuous improvement initiative. And here's why. It goes back to human behavior. In fact, you may have noticed a theme in our webinars and in any training that you've participated with us, that the tools themselves, the hardcore tools, are only about 20% of what we talk about. The other 80% deals with human behavior and culture. When we have a project that is scoped too large, people, they lose momentum. And even if it's a good project, if it's going to take you 9, 12, 15 months to finish that project, it's hard for people to stay motivated that long. And so you need to scale it down because they need to have those attaboys. They need to have those successes to feel like they're making progress, to feel like all this time and effort and meetings and data and all of that is making an impact. They need to know there's a purpose and feel that purpose on there. So, how do you actually get a realistic size scope for your project? Well, remember, this is continuous improvement. Okay? So you want to stair-step your way up there instead of having your people facing the white cliffs of Dover, standing at the bottom, staring up. Okay? So scope out your project. If it's a small Kaizen blitz, something that can be accomplished in 3 to 5 days. Quick, in and out, make an impact. If you're looking at a more complex project, something that goes across function or it is a little bit more involved, 3 to 6 months. But honestly, 6 months is the outset of what a project scope should be. Now, you may have a larger overall initiative or strategy that will go out, but those projects have to be smaller because you need to be able to make an impact. And as you stair-step your way towards improvement and greater efficiency and quality and productivity, again, it builds people's confidence and they feel better about the impact they're having rather than trying to scale these enormous cliff walls and just sometimes feeling overwhelmed and wanting to give up. The third mistake that we see is even if you have a good problem statement and you have a good scope, if you don't have clear agreement with your project sponsor or champion, that can completely derail a project. And that usually comes because there's some type of miscommunication. And so it's not clear for the project champion what you're going after. Or maybe they were not clear in what they wanted you to do. And what can happen is the project team can go off and running. And if they don't ever check back in, and if we haven't really solidified the project scope and definition, you can end up solving the wrong problem. Now, it's not bad to solve a problem. However, if you go back to your project champion a week or really 3-6 months later, and they say, oh, that's great, but you know what? This is what I really wanted you to focus on. You know, I'm so glad that you reorganized the layout of the warehouse and cycle times are done, but it was inventory turns that I really wanted you to focus on. Now go fix that. Guess what just happened to your team morale? Definitely went down the tank. So you need to guard against that. And what is the best way to guard against that? Well, you need to actually write down and document everything you're doing in the define phase. Have a very clear and detailed scope of your project. This is what is within the scope of our project. This is what is outside of the scope of our project. Here is our process map. Here is our COPUS form defining this. This is who is involved in terms of suppliers and customers and team members. Have defined deliverables. And that's going to come from your problem statement. Here's where we are. Here is where we need to be. Here is the expected impact to the business. Actually have a formal sign-off and schedule some periodic reviews. Now, I'm sure some of you are sitting there listening to me talk about this and say, Megan, aren't we just adding additional bureaucracy into the process? Isn't that something that we're trying to avoid? Well, no. You're not adding bureaucracy in the process because it's going to make you more efficient down the line. And I realize that in some organizations, the thought of having a formal sign-off or contract around the project sounds like bureaucracy. However, when you look at how much time it saves you as you're going through your project, it's not bureaucracy at all. In fact, it helps streamline the process and eliminate a lot of the waste that comes in there. Okay, and periodic reviews. Again, anyone listening who has spent any time with me knows that I am not a fan of meetings, because for the most part, I think they're a waste of time because they're not run well. However, having a periodic review with your champion to make sure that you're communicating well and communicating effectively can be a very good thing, because that way you're staying on target and staying on track. Just to give some context, when we talk about project definition, we have entire templates around this. In fact, any of you who have sat in or participated in our Greenbelt training know that we spend a good 8 hours just training on the define phase. It's that important. Now, let me pause here for a moment, because as we're going through this and I'm talking about some of these different tools and different strategies, some of you may be sitting there saying, yeah, that's all well and good, but I need more. That's not giving me the nuts and bolts of what I need in my day-to-day business. Some of you may be like, hey, that's great, I'm off and running. For those of you who are looking for a little bit more of the nuts and bolts piece of this, here are a couple resources, because honestly, we don't want to leave you hanging out there after this webinar is done with questions. So probably right off the bat, if you're not receiving our monthly newsletter, go ahead to our homepage. You can sign up for our newsletter. And again, we're not going to spam you. We're not going to send you your email address. We don't want to junk up your inbox. What we are going to do is give you resources, articles, blog posts, and they're not just ours. They're the best of what we found out there. We're going to give you updated information on training courses, webinars, other things that we have going on. So that's one option. Another thing, all of our webinars are posted up to our YouTube channel. So if you're not subscribed to our YouTube channel, go ahead and subscribe there. That way when we post a new video or resource, you'll know about it. Thirdly, and quite honestly, this is probably the most effective next step from here, is check out the training page on our website. We have online training, and we are adding courses to our catalog all the time. And we're always developing new courses to put out there. Again, some of you may be able to get online, go at your own pace, and you're good to go. Others, you may want a little bit more practical, how do I actually apply this? Which is why with our online training, we have weekly office hours. You can always go in and post a question. We'll be there to reply and kind of walk with you through, how do I actually apply this? How does it work how would it work in this particular environment? Because, theory is nice, but if you can't apply it and actually get an impact to your business, it's kind of worthless. Okay, not really worthless, but it's not going to be very effective for you. So we really designed our online training to let you go at your pace, but you're not alone and stranded out there if you want someone to kind of walk with you through it until you've built your confidence and your competence in that. Okay, so let's get to the last mistake that we see on defining continuous improvement projects, which is poor team selection. And this may seem like a strange mistake, because everything else we've been talking about has been focused on the problem statement and making sure we have agreement with our sponsor and the scope, which it's a bit more tactical. Believe it or not, who you actually have on your project team really can have a big effect on how successful your project is. Because you want to ask your questions, Do they actually give you the right insight that you need? Do they have enough influence within your team and within the organization? Or are you just surrounded by a bunch of yes men that are, no matter what you say, are going to agree? Ideally, you are going to be able to choose who is on your project team. If you are handed a project and your champion or sponsor tells you, oh, you need to include these people on the team, as the project leader, please, this is part of that getting agreement with your sponsor, reserve the right to select a certain number of people on your team. Okay? Because if you were able to do that, here's what you want to do. Make sure people are on that team from the affected area. If you are going to go down and rearrange the punch press area, make sure you have operators from the punch press area on your team. If you are going to go work on reducing the cycle time for accounts receivable, make sure you have someone from accounts receivable on your team. Okay? Because that is going to help you in terms of influencing other people and the successful adoption of your solution. It's also going to help minimize the resistance that you encounter from a particular area. Secondly, when you are selecting your team members, remember, conflict is not bad. Conflict can be very positive if it's done well and constructive, and you as a facilitator can help guide that. Conflict can help you come up with great solutions. So pay attention to how you select your team. In fact, if you want more details on this particular piece, go to the webinar that we held just a couple weeks ago on selecting a successful project team for your continuous improvement initiative. One of our team members, Sarah Gonkas, led that webinar, and she gives much more detail into what you need to do to make sure that you have a good team for your continuous improvement project. But again, when we're looking at defining our projects, listen, how you define those projects has a huge impact on how successful you are. So take the time, slow down, look at your problem statement, make sure it's well defined, look at your project scope, make sure it's something you and your team can actually get your arms around and finish in no more than 4 to 6 months. Make sure you have clear agreement with your sponsor and your champion. And remember, make sure you have a good team. Because even if you have the first 3 and you don't have the right team, you're going to struggle. And if you do the define piece well, your success rate goes up, the length of your project will decrease, and you will build momentum for whatever the initiative is that you're trying to implement in your organization. All right, at this time, we're going to open it up to questions. So if you have not already submitted a question in the comments box, please go ahead and do that in the box right below here. And let's talk about some of the nuts and bolts of how this is actually going to be implemented in your own organization.